Good afternoon. Welcome. This is Aaron Wissner of Local Future, and I am here today with Nicole Foss. Nicole, how are you doing today?
I am doing very well, thank you. It's a lovely autumn day.
And today it is 2020, May 2020, May the 17th. 2020, May the 17th. And here in the United States, Eastern time, it's Sunday, and you are in New Zealand, and it's Monday, is that right?
Morning, yes.
I totally forgot that you were in autumn.
Yeah.
I totally forgot that because here we've been putting in the garden and everything, and it kind of comes to my first question of the day. Is the stock market going to crash, Nicole? What do you think?
Well, yes, but I don't think it's necessarily going to do that right now, because all sorts of things are being bailed out to the nth degree. So I think people are just anticipating that there are going to be more bailouts and that things won't be allowed to fail. So you're not seeing a loss of confidence at this point. But at some point, it's going to happen. It's just a question of when. And we're seeing so much impact on the real economy right now with all the unemployment claims. They're just shot up. This is absolutely historic. There's never been anything like this in the record before. So this is going to have a huge impact on the real economy. There's no question that that's not coming back in its previous form. The markets are basically an artificial construct at the moment because they're just a creature of Fed bailouts. That won't continue forever because nothing ever does continue forever. It's a dynamic situation and it is going to end at some point. So yes, it is going to crash, and yes, it is going to be deflationary. This next couple of years, I think, are going to be just really difficult in a lot of different ways.
Do you think that's likely to happen, the real crash, in 2020 or 2021, or do you have any insight on that?
I think more likely 2020, just because I don't see how they can keep printing things ad infinitum. And I think there's going to be so much upheaval with the election as well. And there's almost certainly going to be shenanigans around the election that are going to be performed by both sides, primarily by one, but probably by both. And this is just going to be so extremely destabilizing. On top of a pandemic, on top of record high unemployment and all manner of other upheavals. Yeah, I think this year is going to be one for the record books for sure.
How is it that the stocks were going down, down, down in March, and then somewhere toward the late part of March, then the stock market, like the Dow Jones Industrial Average in the United States, it started going up and up and up? It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, why is it going up when so many people are losing their jobs? I mean, I don't get it.
What you get in times like this is high volatility. So you don't just get a straight movement down into the basement. You get something that looks more like a lightning bolt. So it goes down and then up and then up. And you get not only the largest down moves in a bear market, you also get the largest up moves, because things are just all over the map and people don't know whether to buy the dip or try and avoid catching a falling knife. There are all kinds of adages that apply to market moves. But people will be moving the market a lot because they don't know where to find the money. And they're going to be trying to chase momentum in both directions, depending on what it is they believe is happening next. And you get these market moves in a bear market all the time. I mean, this is just characteristic. Nothing ever just moves in the one direction. So we've seen a very large down move and we've seen very large up moves. This is going to continue for a number of years, quite likely, with very, very high volatility and people not knowing what to expect next.
Do the central banks have anything to do with the market, like the stock markets going back up again?
Well, they're printing so much money at the moment. They're basically increasing the amount of money that all the big companies have. They're bailing out everything under the sun. And so people are not saying sell these companies because they have no future. They're saying buy them because they're too big to fail and the Fed will bail them out no matter what. And as long as that belief continues, then things aren't going to crash. It's a question of when does that belief end? And it is going to end at some point. So when things are on the up, the Fed looks omnipotent. When the corner is turned, the Fed will look completely useless, and it will be the exact same Fed doing the exact same kind of things. It's the perception that will change, and it can change very quickly, practically from one day to the next. So right now, people think the Fed is omnipotent. They think it's in control of the situation. It really isn't. We just currently think that it is, and in a little while, we will think that it isn't. It actually never was really in control of the situation.
Is it just the Federal Reserve in the United States, or is it all the central banks? I mean, there's
bailouts going on absolutely everywhere. There really are. And there are just far too many things to bail out realistically. The amount of debt is a massive multiple of global GDP. So we have a huge crisis of under-collateralization where there's far more debt that needs to be repaid than there are resources to pay it with. So we are getting ourselves into a huge problem. We've created all these excess claims to underlying real wealth, and now those excess claims are going to be rapidly and messily extinguished over the next few years.
What do you mean by excess claims to underlying real wealth? I've heard you say that many, many times, but I'm not sure I fully understand it, or maybe a viewer would fully understand what you're saying.
Well, for instance, if you have a certain amount of collateral, you have something of value, you want to borrow money.
So like collateral as in land, for example, or
you want to
rocks or books or what?
Whatever you could borrow money against. So it could be a house, it could be a car, it could be a business. You can borrow money based on the fact that you have that asset. Now imagine you
a job, right? Like you have a job.
You have a house, you want to borrow money against your house. So you go to the bank and you say, I have this asset, I would like to borrow money against this asset. And the bank says, all right, and they lend you this money. Then you go to another bank the next day and you say the same thing, I have this house and I want to borrow this money. And you get the same amount of money from them. And you get the same amount of money from the third bank the next day. How many claims do you now have on that one asset? More and more.
People can't do that though. I mean, I can't take my...
But in the City of London, for instance, you are legally allowed to infinitely rehypothecate your assets. That means you can literally do that. You can take the same underlying real wealth and use it as collateral to borrow from umpteen different people. So you only have the one asset, but now you have that one asset backing umpteen different loans, and it can't be used to repay all those loans. Somebody will get the asset and everybody else will get nothing.
That's not like a real person. Not like if Aaron was living in London. No, I couldn't.
This is the big boys, the big players.
Big boys like millionaires?
Oh, the big players, big businesses and things like that. So you're allowed, if you're one of the big players, you're allowed to infinitely rehypothecate your assets in the City of London. And that sort of thing has been happening, not infinitely, but all over the place. What you're getting is multiple claims on the same underlying assets. So this is where your musical chairs game comes in, where you have nowhere near enough chairs for everyone who's playing the game. And when the music stops, people who know how the rules of the game are played will grab a chair as quickly as possible before other people even realize that the music has stopped and they really need to grab a chair right now. And in fact, it's worse than that, because we're not even waiting for the music to stop. They're actually stealing chairs ahead of time. People who know how the game is played are not waiting for the music to stop. So yeah, what you're going to end up with is the rich people basically owning pretty much everything in the initial phase of the crash, but then they get too arrogant and they find that what made them wealthy has now disappeared. They can't maintain their wealth. And so over time, they end up losing their wealth. So over time, a bubble is a great wealth equalizer. So what you get in the middle of it, at the peak of the bubble, is massive inequality. And then it gets worse in the early phase of the downturn, but then it gets better again, but at a very low level. So what ends up happening is people fight over all sorts of things on the way down. A whole lot of stuff that people collectively owned got wrecked. And so at the end, you all end up roughly in the same boat and you start again from there. But a whole lot of things have been wrecked, so you don't have very much to start with. But it can be done. Humans have done it multiple times before, just not from some of the things that could happen this time.
So one of the questions I had off the internet today was deflation. Is deflation coming? When is it coming? I mean, how does a person tune in so that they can kind of, see it coming and feel it coming? How does a person really know it's happening in like the real world or in media?
Well, there's been an enormous amount of money being pumped into the system. It started the end of last year with all the market trillions being pumped into the repo market. So this was to prevent the overnight lending rates from going absolutely through the roof. That would have been a sign that the markets were in desperate trouble right then and there. So the Fed was intervening in order to prevent that signal from being sent. So they didn't want people to realize just how much trouble the banks are in. If the banks had revealed that they weren't even prepared to trust each other for overnight lending for less than some sky high rate of interest, that would have damaged confidence significantly. So that was what they were trying to avoid. Eventually it won't work because they can't bail out absolutely everything. There just isn't enough money. And the thing is, what they want to do is bail out all the big players, but eventually the smaller players just won't be able to keep going without some kind of bailout of their own. And when you basically bankrupt all the debtors pretty much at once, you are going to bankrupt the creditors as well. There's really no way that you can let all the debtors go under and make the creditors all whole. So at that point, you're going to get chaos. You really are. And you're going to start to see the destruction of the value of credit instruments. So distressed debt being sold, for instance. You already see some of this now. There's going to be an awful lot more of it. People have been buying up distressed medical debt, for instance, because you can buy up, if you can raise money, you can buy up a medical debt for 10 cents on the dollar and then just tell people, congratulations, you don't owe that money anymore. And you've paid off their medical debt for 10% of what they owed. So,
that actually happened in Michigan. There were some there were some churches near Jackson, Michigan, I believe, and they got together some tens of thousands of dollars. They bought a bunch of debt owed by medical debt by people in the city, probably, congregants, parishioners, whatever. And then they just bought it and they said, your medical debts have been paid.
Yep, which is an excellent thing to do, but it is also a signal that they know that debt is not going to be repaid. Whoever was holding that debt would not have sold it for 10 cents on the dollar or whatever it was if they had thought there was any chance of getting more money than that. So when you start to see distressed debt being sold off, that's definitely a signal that you're moving into deflation, because people are no longer trusting the promise to repay. Because all of this rests on nothing but promises. Yeah, sure, I'll write an IOU for you today. I'm good for it. That sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, you're not good for it, and everybody ends up not good for it at the same time. So the house of cards comes down, because all of a sudden people no longer believe in the value of human promises. And the vast, vast majority of the wealth in the world is nothing but a pile of empty promises at this point, because there's nowhere near enough wealth to actually back that up.
This reminds me of thinking of money as a claim on the future. So you give me $10 or 10 pounds or whatever, and that represents something that I can buy in the future. Most importantly, food, which is life to me. I need food. So I can take my $10 and buy a few days worth of food, or a day for my family maybe. But the more money that's out there, you're stretching that you're buying stuff further and further into the future. Isn't that right? The more money there is, you're basically saying, oh, I can buy a year out or 2 years out or 5 years out. Or
Yeah, you're creating more claims. So what you're basically doing, if you print actual physical currency, you're taking your real wealth pie and you're cutting it into more and more and more pieces. But each piece is then very small. So you still end up with, everyone still has as many pieces of pie as they had before, but now the pieces of pie that they have are tiny.
But this sounds like hyperinflation, not deflation.
That would be hyperinflation. What you have with deflation is you take your real wealth pie and you don't cut it into more pieces. You create more claims to each piece of pie. So people think that they have the same size piece of pie that they had before, but they don't. Now their piece of pie, they probably are not going to get any pie because 99 other people have a claim on the same piece of pie, and chances are an awful lot of those are higher up the financial food chain than the person in question, so they're going to be out of luck. And
so I think what you're implying is that if everybody went out right now with all the money and credit they had, everybody, individuals, and they just started buying up everything that is actually valuable, like food and energy, and I mean those are the most valuable things, like food and energy, and they just start buying it up, that it would be all gone within a day or two, and then there'd be all these people there'd be no food left, no energy left.
There's nothing left to claim. That's the problem. You can create as many claims as you want, but you can't create what those claims are a claim on. Like, so you can't print value, you can't print energy, and you can't print oil, things like that. So you can create many, many claims, but there's nothing you can do to create what the people actually wanted. You can just create an empty claim for people. And what's being done right now is more and more and more claims are being created, but they're being created electronically. So it's not like we have extra actual banknotes in circulation. In fact, we would have fewer because the velocity of money is falling as well. So it's not like we have extra money in circulation. We have
the velocity of money falling, meaning that people are spending less per month than they did a month ago or 2 months ago or 3 months ago. They're saving more and spending less. So overall, the spending might be only half of what it was a couple months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're getting is a situation where there's a lot less spending, a lot less economic activity is going to be able to be supported. So not only do you have excess claims to underlying real wealth, but the amount of underlying real wealth is disappearing at the same rate because you're going to have a whole lot of economic activity that cannot be supported and then is going to go away. So you're going to have businesses that go under.
So something I saw regarding that just today or yesterday was people have to come to the restaurants because the restaurants are opening like in various states and countries, but people have to come because if they don't come, then if they don't buy stuff. And then there was another story I heard about, well, in some places, the shops are being opened if they're like have an outdoor entrance. So you can come in from the outdoors and you go right back outside into the outside. But you have the same shop in a shopping mall, an enclosed shopping mall. Those aren't allowed because they're worried about congestion. So now you've got the people who are going to go and buy because they think that's safer in the outdoor venues. And the ones who are going to the shopping malls are like, no, I'm not going to the shopping mall. That's not very clever at all. And so the shopping malls could be really, well, especially since they don't have the anchor stores even open. I think we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. So is this the thing you're talking about where people aren't spending? So all these businesses that expect, I mean, not everybody can get half, if only half the money is being spent, then it's either going to get spread out evenly half to everybody, in which case nobody stays in business, or some businesses are going to get more and some are going to get a lot less than half, right?
Oh, yes. You're going to have winners and losers enormously. There are going to be some people, people who run businesses with local supply chains and local distribution networks, things that are conservatively managed so that they don't depend on debt and constantly having to roll over credit and things like that. companies like that, especially if they're providing essential goods and services, they could do extremely well, because what little money people have is going to come in their direction. Whereas businesses that are selling things that really aren't necessary at all, they're just kind of nice to have, but they depend on somebody having a bunch of mad money. Well, those are going to go out of business because there's not going to be any mad money in the system. And people, even if people do have a bit of money left over, chances are they're going to hang on to it because they don't know if they're going to lose their jobs. So many other people are losing their jobs. And we won't know yet for quite a while how many businesses are going to go under, but people have to be concerned that it might be the one that they work for. So they're going to spend even less than they otherwise would, even if they still have a job and they still have money. So this is what happened in Japan. I mean, the government tried to get people to spend for decades and was basically handing people money, and people still wouldn't go out and spend it because they were in a mindset that reinforced deflation and depression. And that mindset can go on for a very, very long time. I mean, it went on for a decade in the States. It went on for 30 years in Japan. And this is going to happen again. So we are going to see this same kind of deflationary crash. This is how credit hyperinflations always end. So it's not optional. It's not a choice. It is going to happen. It's simply a matter of when. Because when you have created a credit bubble, it is going to burst. There are not enough resources to be able to make good on all those promises. So we will not make good on the promises. We'll default on the promises. And that is deflation by definition. And that's very much what we're going to see. When we've seen the destruction of credit instruments, at that point, then we may actually get the printing of real physical currency. So you could get a currency hyperinflation at that point, but that comes later. That comes further down the line when you've already had the deflationary period.
So in the last couple of weeks, I've seen a couple small businesses in Michigan near me close. Well, actually three. First was the Chinese restaurant, which closed pretty quickly, even though it had 0 Chinese employees. I mean, they closed like permanently forever. Then this week, a hair salon, which had 10 chairs or something like that, catering mainly to women, that closed. And then a guitar shop, a musical instrument shop, also closed. And so there's all these business owners out there. There might be one watching the show right now. What should they be doing right now? I mean, suppose you were talking to your best friend and they were the owner of this music instrument store. What should they be doing really right now in 2020 May?
Well, the kind of businesses that are going to survive are the ones with the local distribution networks, local supply chains that are selling essential goods and services to people locally. So if people are in a business that is not being run that way, then I would suggest that they should try and change it to run that way if there's any way they possibly can. The other thing that might be possible for some businesses would be to do very high-end luxury niche products for people who can still afford to travel around and buy incredibly expensive things. But there are not going to be very many people in that sort of niche. So I certainly wouldn't count on that. And you would have to be incredibly high end if you were going to distinguish yourself from other retailers of things. So I think by far the best bet for the majority of businesses is to do everything they possibly can to relocalize the way their business is run and try and reduce whatever structural dependencies they have, particularly fuel costs, for instance. So if they can change their supply chains and distribution networks so that things are far more local, then their fuel costs will go down a lot. And perhaps the complexity of their distribution operation could be reduced significantly as well. And there may be ways of changing businesses to, instead of deliver everything door to door, to have some central depots where you come and pick things up. So businesses run like that may have lower overheads, for instance. Trying to keep overheads down, I think, is going to be really important. So to not have fancy things that add to the costs that don't necessarily add to the value of what you're selling. So I think a whole lot of cheap and cheerful type places will probably do quite well. Dollar stores, Costco, Walmart, things like that, where things are very, very cheap. But those places are also going to have to worry about distribution networks and supply chains, because they're also so massive that they're going to have trouble maintaining low prices if those low prices only came as a result of global wage arbitrage, for instance. So if you are trying to run a local business, you're going to have to pay people what it costs to live locally. So I think things that can maintain a lower cost structure because they can all be local should end up doing really quite well too. But it'll depend on the local circumstances and what's there to support a business in any given place. So working with the resources that you have in a local area is important. If there's some critical resource that isn't available in the local area, it may be a good idea to set up a business trying to import it. So to think, what do we produce in our area that we could trade for this very important substance that we don't have, and things, and try to find ways to do that. Because I think it's going to be very difficult for people to exist entirely, like 100% on what's available locally. Some people can do it because some areas are more blessed than others, but some places are extremely seasonal, for instance, and there are things you might have some of the time, but not the rest of the time. And so I think some kind of trade is still going to be necessary. I don't think it'll be anything like the amount of trade that we currently have, but I do think some kind of trade will be important. I think if people are going to do that, they have to think in terms of trading essential goods, though, because there's no point in thinking that your business model will be trading cheap plastic tat made in China to Americans anymore, because there's going to be no market for that sort of thing. So it really depends what it is you're bringing in. If you're going to bring something over a long distance, it had better be a reasonably high value kind of product. Other things will need to be made locally.
So with the three examples I gave you, I'd like to just take a guess and then get your input on each one, and I'll give you all three. So one was the restaurant. It happened to be Chinese, but I don't know that that makes a huge difference. The second was the hair salon, and the third was the guitar, or the music shop. And so in the case of the restaurant, my feeling is that people are spending less and they're more comfortable eating at home now because they've been at home for a long time. So and overall,
homemade bread tastes really, really good.
Oh my gosh, it does. Yes. Especially when it's hot out of the oven and you just cut it with a knife and get a slice. And
I wish I could eat it.
Yeah. My wife has gotten very good at making that homemade bread, and it takes what, 3 or 4 ingredients in an oven. So, but for the restaurants, I mean, what I'm seeing is a lot less staff, a whole lot less staff, and then maybe consolidation of restaurants. So instead of maybe 10 in a town, you only need 5 because people just aren't going out as much. So that the ones that are the most popular, I'm not sure how to decide which ones would stay in business and which ones would not stay in business. But I guess the ones where we're making stuff where you couldn't really make it easily at home, right? Where it's like really nice, but not too expensive.
Yeah, some of that. I think ones that cater to business lunches are going to have a hard time because businesses are going to cut back the most, I think. And cutting back on things like taking clients out for lunch, I think is definitely something that's quite likely to happen. It's not that they won't eat with clients, but they'll do things in their own internal cafeteria or something like that, or just eat something, invite the client round to their own home for dinner or something along those lines. So I do think there are going to be big changes. I think restaurants are going to be out of luck, an awful lot of restaurants. My brother is a chef, and he says most restaurants become economically viable when the kitchen has been bankrupted 3 times. In other words, when you basically write everything off and sell it off at distressed prices to somebody else, then they have a go, and that happens again. And then they have a go, and that happens again. At that point, then you've actually got something where you can make a profit on what you had to pay for the equipment. But in other words, good luck trying to ever make a profit at a restaurant if you had to pay to put the equipment in the first place. You basically had to inherit the equipment at a distressed price in order to make a go of it. And I think restaurants are going to go out of business right, left, and center, because that is going to be something that people can easily cut back on. So I
So
absolutely.
you're suggesting basically the collapse of the entire industry that provides kitchens for restaurants. So any group that makes like stoves and large refrigerators and any of that, there's not going to be a market for it. Nobody's going to want to buy it because they'll have so many options. Just buy
Exactly.
the Chinese restaurant, just buy the so-and-so restaurant. Nobody's
And
going
that
to.
won't be just restaurants. It'll be so many things. I mean, imagine you have something like a Walmart or something like that that goes out of business. What does that do to every other shop that sells the same kind of stuff? Walmart was already cheap. And then when it's going out of business, it'll be selling everything off for way less. And then the other companies that were hanging on by their fingernails won't be able to compete with those distressed prices, and they'll go under too. And you end up with just this downward spiral of enormous amounts of goods on the market all at once, going for a song, but so few people having any money that even for a song, they don't want to buy these things. So a whole lot of stuff is just going to end up in landfill. Nobody's going to want it at all. And there are going to be an enormous range of things that are just going to be thrown away. Now, with musical instruments, I don't think someone will be throwing those away. I think those will have value, but I don't think it'll be very easy to make a business out of selling them when people don't have any money. So you probably can, but it won't be easy, and the margins will be very, very squeezed. But people really value music, and if you have someone who can play the fiddle and in your village hall once a week or something, then that person will probably find that they never go hungry because their service will be worth enough to people that everyone will feed them, for instance. So I think music is a good thing to stick with, but just expect the margins to be extremely, extremely thin. And I don't think anyone's going to be able to sell something like a Stradivarius if they're really that good at making musical instruments. It's going to be very hard to find a market for things that are truly expensive.
So for the hair salons, in this case, I would think again that the hair salons, I mean, people basically are not, it's been 3 months, 4 months since I had a haircut. It's fine. I just trimmed over my ears a couple times, and a lot of people are trimming each other's hair, especially the kids. I'm thinking the market, I mean, it's going to be at least no more than half in a lot of places as far as how much money is going in revenue for all the hair salons. Plus, people are not going to be buying all the products either because they're like, I've went 3 months without the products, and yeah, it's getting a little gray. I guess it's just going to go gray.
Yep, I absolutely agree. I mean, that's something that people are going to find is not essential. And when something is not essential, then people will save their money for the things that are essential. So I think people are going to go back to having long hair that's easy to look after when you just have to put it in a braid, or it's easy to trim long hair. It's only when you have fancy styles and things that you need professionals to do it. And these are hair treatments are so expensive now. I mean, I used to do fancier things to my hair than I currently do, and it really was adding up. So, I mean, these days, I think I spend about $10 on my hair once every 4 months or something like that. I just buy a box of hair coloring from the store for $10, and we're good to go. And maybe once every couple of years, I actually trim some off the bottom. But yeah, I'm certainly not going to be keeping hairdressers in business anytime soon. And people are finding that there are a lot of things they can do for themselves. And if they're unemployed, they're going to have less money and more time. So they're probably going to expand what they're doing for themselves even more. And then, of course, you end up with a lot more businesses going under because nobody has the money to be patronizing those anymore. I mean, we're not going to have anything like the percentage of businesses survive that did in previous downturns, I think, because you're just seeing such a huge spike in unemployment that there's going to be so many fewer people who can afford to buy what these businesses are producing that I think an incredible percentage of them will just go under.
How about the idea, suppose you had a business that was kind of doing okay, but you're just not making the bills, like rent too much. You can't pay for rent and insurance and electricity and water, and taxes and, you know, whatever necessary goods you need to make your finished product. So, I mean, it seems to me like in that case, you go to the tax agent, the city or the township or whatever, and you go to whoever is renting the place to you or the mortgage company or whatever, and you say, hey, I can pay half. And it's either half or I close. What do you want? Do you want half or you want me to close? And I'm not talking half and then I catch up. I'm talking about it's going to have to be half for a while. And then, you know, when I get back in business, doesn't it make sense to do that rather than say, oh, I'm just going to close. I'm just going to close because
they will try. They will absolutely try. And eventually it will happen. But the thing is, it may not happen quickly enough because I think there are too many lenders who think, oh, well, the recovery's coming. Why should I miss out on rents by dropping them now when the economy is going to recover and then it'll take me a while to put the rents back to where they were? And I would say that would be terrible because things are not going to come back to where they were, not anytime soon. And if they don't accept lower rent payments, then they are going to find they get no rent payments at all. And then the creditors go under too. What really distinguishes the large cycles from the small ones is in the small ones, the debtors go under. In the large ones, the creditors go under as well. And in the biggest ones, then you're talking about everything. The debtors, the creditors, the governments, everything basically goes under and you start again from scratch. And I think this one is going to be one for the record books. So I think we are going to see that sort of thing happen again. Not immediately, doesn't happen all in one go, but over the next several decades, I think we're really going to see all of this unwind and a major reset.
One more question before we get to, we've got a number of comments on YouTube and I want to try to address a few of them. But the question is like airlines. So something I heard today about the airlines, read today, was that the airlines only need 10% of the flight attendants, 10%. So instead of needing like 35,000, they only need 4,000. And so is what you're saying about restaurants and salons and little shops, does this scale up to the larger corporations in a similar way?
Oh, yes. That's exactly the problem. I mean, you're just not going to have the demand because people are going to have a lot less money. And of the money they do have, they're going to be afraid to spend it. So you just don't have the money circulating in the economy. And when you don't have money circulating in the economy, you can't support economic activity at anything remotely like the level that you previously could. So on average, when a bubble bursts, you collapse to the tune of 90%. 90% of your previous economic activity and your financial value will go away. And then you'll be restarting from the bottom with what was left over. And that's absolutely what I see happening. I mean, you're not going to have an airline industry in the previous way we previously did, because there's just going to be no way that ordinary people are going to be able to afford it. And because you're not going to have ordinary people flying, you're not going to have the same amount of airline capacity. You're not going to have the freight capacity. And a lot of the airlines were making money on freight, not necessarily on the passengers, but you're going to end up with less passengers and less freight. So you just don't end up with a viable business model at the end of the day. So I can see there still being air travel, but I think it's going to be an extremely elitist thing. And I don't think it's going to be something that a whole bunch of working class people jump on a plane and go to Corfu for a week in the middle of the summer or something.
So it doesn't sound like Boeing and Airbus and Embraer really are going to have a lot of people buying their planes.
No, they're not.
Because there's going to be so many planes, they're just sitting around.
Yep, there are indeed. And at some point, they're just going to be stranded assets. Nobody's going to want them. And by the time demand might have a chance to pick up, these things probably won't be fit for purpose anymore. Because there's a limit to how long you can leave something sitting in the desert and hoping it won't rot in place. You know, it won't last forever if you do that. This is what's happening with the ghost cities in China as well. People were building ghost cities thinking, oh, the demand will pick up eventually. But some of these are falling apart before anyone's even lived in them. just because they weren't built very well. They were built to make a profit in the short term because there was a housing bubble, and they may never have yet served as housing for anybody, and they're already falling to bits. So you get this sort of thing a lot in bubbles. You get enormous wastes of money. So enormous amounts of money being plowed into things that have absolutely no future, and very, very little investment in things that do have a future, because the things that do have a future are small and simple. They're not going to make huge outsized profits for anybody. So people are just ignoring those things completely. But they're going to regret that at some point, because those small, simple things would have been the things that would have allowed us to climb back down the ladder. Because what we did, we climb up the ladder, and every time we climb up to a higher rung, we make sure we kick out the rung underneath. So then you don't have a way to get back down again. These small, simple things are the rungs that would get you back down again. So these are the things that we absolutely have to rebuild, because otherwise the only way to jump it is to jump from a great height, the only way back down, and that's going to hurt. You know, I think if people can set up the kind of businesses that will be rungs on the way down, then that would be absolutely fantastic. And not just for them, it will be fantastic for their whole neighborhood, because you are going to need businesses to do things like that. You know, you can't just not have any businesses and still expect to have a system that works, that feeds people and clothes them and keeps them warm and things.
So it seems to me like the businesses that are going to be the most valuable are going to be ones that provide food at a low cost locally, because if it's grown locally and provided locally, it can be at a pretty low cost. And that also means local storage, like in the winter and in the springtime. So local storage of food, like in a village or a city or a township or something. And help
too.
Say that again.
I think there's going to be a whole lot of salvage, because there are tons of things that have been thrown out that were still usable. They were just thrown out because people couldn't be bothered to fix them. They would rather have a new model anyway. And I mean, John Michael Greer has written a lot about this sort of thing as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of salvage industry going on. I remember watching a BBC program years ago, at least 20 years ago, when I was still living in the UK. It was called All Our Children. And one of the families that I remember, all of the family, their job was to climb around all day, every day on a garbage dump in Manila and pick out things that they could sell at the end of the day and things. So that is already happening all over the world. This is something that happens. And I think we're going to find that people here do that as well, because there's a lot of valuable stuff. And you know, they already have programs on people going around finding other people's junk and things all over the place. There's going to be a lot more of that, I think.
Okay, so let's go to a few questions real quick. Mario online is wondering about the S&P 500, and I don't really know what's the difference anyway between like the Dow Jones the Dow Jones market and the S&P. What are there different things for sale in the different ones?
The broader index, that's all. So
okay, so
look at there are different indices. There's the transports and the small caps, and
he's wondering about the S&P 500 in particular.
Yeah, that's simply a broader index. But so, I mean, you're paying attention to all of them.
Do you think that market is going to go down also? I mean, yes. I don't know what level it's at. Is it going to sink another 3 or 4% or 10%?
I think all those markets are going to crash. I don't think there's going to be a safe haven pretty much anywhere, unless you own farmland with no debt, for instance. So there are things that are really good to have and to buy and hold now, but only if you don't have to take on debt to do it. Because if you do take on debt to do it, chances are that you're going to lose the asset anyway, because you will probably not be able to service the debt at some point.
Well, here's an interesting figure. There are, in the United States, as far as farmland is concerned, there's about 900 million acres of farmland. There's about 300 million people. So that's about 3 acres of farmland per human who lives in the United States. But most people in the United States don't own anywhere close to 3 acres. I mean, most people live in cities, actually, like 70%. And a lot of them live in suburbs where they don't have anywhere close to an acre. So most people don't have land, really.
That's absolutely true. And we are going to end up having some kind of land redistribution system eventually, but not at the beginning. In the beginning, you get concentration of land ownership, far, far more than you have now even. But over time, then you get a revolution, and then you get redistribution of land. Because when things hit a certain level of inequality, they just become completely unsustainable, and that system will eventually be torn down.
What do you think of these retirement savings accounts? Like in the United States, they're called 401ks, 403bs, IRAs, Roth IRAs, and basically you're giving the money to somebody and then they're buying stocks or something with it. What do you think of all those things?
I think they're a bad idea because you're not going to get any money out at some point. So people often buy annuities, like they have a pot of money, and they'll go out and they'll say to some financial services company, okay, I have this pot of money. I want you to pay me a certain amount per month for the rest of my life. With this size pot of money up front, how much will you pay me per month? And then the company will have its actuaries thinking about how long you're going to live, and it's going to offer you an amount that's low enough that it thinks it'll make a profit over the rest of your life based on the pot of money that you had. But it will only be able to keep the promise to pay that annuity every month if it stays in business itself. So you can give them your pot of money up front, then they've got the money, and whether or not they can give you the money that they've promised to give you in return is a bit of a crapshoot. And I don't think that's a very good bet to take at this point. So I don't think it's a good idea to hand over any pots of money that you don't absolutely have to hand over. If you can hang on to it yourself and maintain control over it yourself, then I think that's vastly better than having something that's locked into the system, because there are a whole lot of companies that are not going to be able to keep those promises that they have made. And then what people think they're going to get is not going to appear.
Would you tell people who are like taking money out of their IRA and putting it in cash, or buying like farmland or buying a homestead, would you say, oh, you guys are crazy, you guys should be leaving your money there, or you should be putting it in, you should be buying Bitcoin, or you should be buying gold certificates? Would you say they're crazy if they're doing something like that?
I would say go ahead and buy the farmland or the homestead, but you don't want to buy something that you have to take out debt on, because then you're just going to lose your equity in whatever it is you just bought. So if you can buy something that is going to be
how about rent first for a few years and then buy, or something like that?
You can do that. I mean, it depends on the circumstances. It depends what resources you have to play with, because if you've got a lot of resources, you don't have to make as many hard choices. You can pay for today's prices for farmland, for instance. If you don't have a lot of money, you're almost certainly not going to be paying today's prices for farmland, because that won't be an option for you. So you have no choice, if you want farmland, but to wait until prices come down. But if you have more resources, you don't have to wait. You can secure something really worth having up front. And if you're prepared to make compromises, then you may be able to do that even if you don't have a lot of money. So you and several other people, for instance, could get together and say, we all know each other really well. We'll collectively buy this farm and we'll run it jointly. And then you don't need to have debt, because you had several people pitching assets in to do it. And you may have several people out of your group who are actually going to do the farming work. And you might have other people in your group who are working off-site and bringing in income streams from somewhere else that will allow you to pay something. So you might even be able to cope with a small amount of mortgage if you did that. If you have enough income streams and enough able-bodied workers to really make it work, then there are options that are open to you that wouldn't be open to you if you didn't have those things. So there's no one right choice. There are multiple different ways that you can make things work. And so I think people really have to be super aware of their local circumstances and say, if I want to stay here, what sort of things do I have here? Like, do some community asset mapping. What does this community have here? What do we not have? If there's something that we don't have, do we really, really need it? And if so, is there anything we can substitute for it, for instance, things like that? So you go through a kind of decision tree and you work out what to do that works best collectively. The last DVD I did was called Challenge and Choices, which was about doing exactly that, saying, okay, well, this is limits to growth. These are the things you need to know about. Now that you know about limits to growth, now what are you going to do? So I went through a whole series of choices saying, what do you want to be urban? Do you want to be rural? Do you want to be eco-village? Do you want to be in a small town? You hear the pros and cons of each of those different choices. What are other things to bear in mind? So what about the seasonality, the climate, natural hazards, and things like that? So what sort of risks do you think you could live with? Are there any risks you find uniquely horrifying? Well, then strike off certain parts of the world. But you go through all these different choices and you end up with something that tells you what you personally could most easily live with. So what sort of things you feel that you really need, and what kind of environment you feel that you need to be in order to be happy, for instance. And when you go through decision trees like that, then you can really end up with something that's really quite workable. But you have to think about it in advance and do the planning in advance, because if you wait too long, you're just going to be stuck. I mean, you end up in a place where you have debt on it. You end up with negative equity. You can't sell. You lose a job. You're stuck somewhere. And if it's not somewhere you wanted to be stuck, then you could be really, really out of luck. But if it is somewhere you're perfectly happy to be stuck, then it's not a problem at all. It's just you have to do the thinking up front in order to really know what it is that you want and what you don't. I mean, I can send you a copy of my latest DVD if you want. It's a few years old now, but I think when did I do that? It was the end of 2014 was the last DVD that I did. So I don't know if you would have seen that one.
Is that something, are those DVDs things that are like current enough that people could get them and still get a lot of use out of them? Are those things that you might be interested in updating, yes, like pulling your slides out and maybe getting online sometime and sharing those again?
Yeah, absolutely. So the latest DVD it's 3 hours long, and there's just one DVD this time, but I just went through the limits to growth scenario, and then went through all the different choices that people were going to have to make, all the things they were going to have to think about. And
where can people find that if they want to get a copy of that?
Well, I can sell them through my current website, which is called Applied Systems Thinking. We haven't set up a shop yet, but we can. I don't think it would take all that long. And we can produce however many of them people would be interested in.
Okay. Is that something you'd want to refresh, like just redo the presentation, re-record it, or was that a lot of work to do?
I think that one is still good enough the way it is. I will end up doing another one with more up-to-date material, but the material in that one, it doesn't really date in the same way, because it wasn't so much talking about exactly what was happening now. It was looking at the kind of choices that people would have to make. And those are the choices people always have to make. Like, are you an urbanite or are you a rural person, and things like that. And those aren't choices that go out of style, so to speak. But right. Yeah, I can send you one of, if you can send me the address, I can send you one of these DVDs, and then you can decide if you think it's something that people would be interested in, and you can put an ad up at Local Futures or something if you think they would be.
Well, Local Future's a nonprofit, so we'll have to figure out exactly how to do that aspect of it. But I'm sure, for people who want to hear more of your ideas, then they should have an opportunity to do that. I mean, I believe that too. Hey, one of our other folks that's on right now, and hey, if you are on right now, you have not yet pressed the like button. So go ahead and press the like button.
There's the like button.
The thumbs up, And if you haven't put a comment in, put a comment in. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and click the bell for notifications so that you probably already had notifications on, didn't you? So, okay. And if you're watching this later on, try 1.5 speed, because that works pretty good. I've been told 2.2 times speed is a little bit fast because Nicole is a speedy talker, but I'm a slow talker. So try 1.5 speed and can you get through this in less time. Okay, so this question is energy. How does energy play into all of this? So like coal and oil and nuclear and natural gas and hydro and biomass and solar and wind and whatever else there is? How do they play into this big picture of the future that we're looking at?
Well, I mean, every species relies on its energy supply in order to survive. And normally, there's not a whole lot of excess energy lying around. So if you happen to come across a bunch of excess energy, you tend to use it up as quickly as you possibly can, because if you don't, somebody else will. So pots of energy, like say a dead mammoth or something like that, is not going to be lying around for very long. Something will come along and make use of that energy. Now, we as a species managed to find an enormous amount of excess energy in the form of fossil fuels, the like of which no other species in the history of Earth could have imagined having access to that much energy. Energy gives you the opportunity to increase the complexity of your civilization. Now, you can be reasonably complex without fossil fuels. I mean, the Roman Empire was reasonably complex, but it didn't reach the level of technological complexity that we do because we had fossil fuels and they didn't. So our level of communications technology and insane levels of complexity with computing and things like that, all of this rests on the fact that we discovered fossil fuels. And the reason that fossil fuels are so useful is they have an incredibly high energy return on energy invested. So for a long time, you didn't have to put much energy into finding them and using them because they were simply available. Coal reasonably near the surface, oil seeps and things like that. You didn't have to put a lot of effort in the early days to get a lot of energy back. So we had a huge amount of energy available for society's purposes. So we then built an incredibly complicated society because we had all that energy. The problem is when you get to the point where you're peaking in terms of your supplies, you can't keep increasing your production year on year. When you get to the point where you're peaking, not only can you not keep building more complexity, but you can no longer maintain the complexity that you already have. So then you end up having to put all your resources into trying to maintain things. You can't really do it. So you have to let a lot of things go. And you have to go back to being a much simpler kind of society. And I think that's absolutely what's going to happen. So we're moving from an era of very, very high energy return on energy invested energy sources, so oil and coal and natural gas, into much, much lower and EROEI energy sources. And that has huge implications because you have to put more and more energy in upfront in order to produce anything at all. You get less and less back. And so you just do not have anywhere near the energy surplus that society had. So that's where you really end up in a problem where you can't maintain things, you can't build new things, and you absolutely have to simplify your society. So only the things that people are talking about for the future, renewables and things like that. Well, for one thing, they're not renewable because the sun will keep shining and the wind will keep blowing, but concrete and rebar and rare earth metals are not renewable. So Michael Moore put out a film about all of these issues recently, and Michael Moore is right. So it's very controversial, this film, but he is right. We are not going to be able to maintain the kind of life that we have based on those sorts of energy sources. And we're not going to be able to maintain the lifestyle we have based on the energy sources we currently use either, because they are depleting. So the implication is we are not going to be maintaining the lifestyle that we currently have. We're just going to have to wrap our heads around the fact that we're going to have less energy in the future than we currently do. So we should be thinking of what are the supplies that we have. What are the things that matters most that we do with them? How can we give ourselves the most sort of bang for the energy buck, so to speak? And this is why I wrote an article called The Boundaries and Future of Solution Space, because I wanted to look at all the things that are superficially attractive, but they're non-starters because they're capital intensive or energy intensive, or they rely on large scale, top down, high trust environments and things like that. So these are things that are going to be non-workable in the future. And my point in writing that essay was to go through the things that are not going to be possible and say, well, we're not even going to think about this because this obviously won't work. go through, eliminate the things that obviously won't work and say, okay, what's left, and see what kind of picture we can make out of what's likely to be left. I mean, it's a model. It's not a guarantee that those things will definitely be there, but at least the things that would be left are things that wouldn't be prima facie impossible, that are definitely not going to work, that you know up front are not going to work. If you can concentrate on the things that have a chance of working, then you can focus on building something that will get as many people through a bottleneck as you possibly can. And I think that's really what we want to do. We want to try and get the world through the bottleneck that comes at the end of the fossil fuel era without massive environmental destruction and all kinds of suffering, because that's quite likely to happen, I would say. And if we can minimize it as much as we possibly can, then that's probably what we should be aiming for.
So I'm going to give you two questions at the same time, and then I want to throw up a slide that I pulled from a document. And so the first question is, for individuals, does it make sense, I mean, if they're like entrepreneurs, for them to be looking into providing, you know, energy services, I guess you could say it, to their local communities, their neighborhoods or whatever? And the second question is, if you can take a look at this slide and just give me your thoughts on it, how does this connect to what you're saying about energy?
Well, it's looking where the energy comes from and where it goes. And diagrams like that are useful because you want to see where things are going. That tells you where you might have the capacity to make efficiencies, for instance. And it tells you what sort of things you might have a chance of scaling up that might have an impact. But I mean, for instance, if you look at renewables, you can tell that no time soon is that little blue line going to substitute for, say, the black one that was coal, or the mustard colored one that's gas, or the oil one. I mean, it's simply not going to happen. You know, you can really only have renewable energy like solar PV and massive wind turbines if you have fossil fuels to build the turbines and the panels anyway. So, I mean, they're really an extension of the fossil fuel system rather than a replacement for it. And we can use renewables in a way that doesn't require fossil fuels. So, for instance, in Holland, they had windmills all over the place that turned mill wheels. They didn't make electricity, but they would turn a mill wheel for you. That was a very useful energy service to provide. Paris ran on compressed air systems. You can do that without fossil fuels. You can have solar thermal systems. Again, you don't need fossil fuels for that. You can just run pipes on your roof and the sun will warm up the water for you. You can use that for hot water, for space heating and things like that. So there are ways you can do it where you can maximize the AROAI. And those are the things that we're going to be doing, the smaller, simpler things that don't require fossil fuel inputs, or if they do require fossil fuel inputs, only require the absolute minimum ones, so that you still have enough left to run society's other purposes.
So it sounds like there is a future for people who are like entrepreneurial as far as thinking about how to provide energy services to themselves and their neighbors and their communities.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and I think we need entrepreneurial people, but we need people who are thinking not just about how do I get as rich as possible, as quickly as possible. You need people who really want to love a business, not just for the money that it will produce, but because they really like making whatever widgets it is that they make, or really like providing whatever service it is they provide. So they're getting fulfillment in their life out of what it is that they're doing with that life, and they're providing essential goods and services to their neighbors as well. These are the kind of things that we really need.
I have to say, one of the just as a comment to insert in here, the energy storage that I find the most intriguing is called pumped hydro. When you pump water up high, like into a water tower, and then you have like a micro hydro turbine and you let the water down. When it comes down, you get the energy back out. And that can be, I think that with good pumps, that can be somewhere around 70%, 80% efficient. And it's kind of simple. I mean, as far as mechanically.
You
So
kind of need the topography for it, though, because
sure.
if you have to create the topography, then that's going to take you more energy than you're ever going to get from the system. So if the topography is already there and all you have to do is make use of it, then fantastic. There are pump storage places in North Wales, for instance, that I've visited. There's pump storage in Scandinavia. It doesn't exist everywhere. Not everywhere is equally blessed. So some places can do it and some places really, really can't. Any form of energy storage is going to be energy intensive and capital intensive to build. So you do have to be really, really careful and not necessarily intend to provide enough power to make sure that the lights always come on when somebody flicks a switch, but that the essential loads can still perform. So I think we're going to have to put up with a lot more intermittent use of power. So some things we might be able to guarantee will always come on, the really important things. So like the heating in the middle of winter and things like that. But there may be other things that are going to have to be intermittent, and people will just have to make do with less convenient options and things. So make sure that they have some flashlights or candles or something for times when there isn't power. But it's interesting that if you actually do have intermittent supply, people get creative very, very quickly. And it's actually extremely useful to have a bit of intermittency for that reason. So in India, for instance, they had a blackout in 2012, and they have blackouts in India absolutely all the time. So and some of them are planned, some of them are unplanned. They go on for hours and hours a day. It's really, really typical. The ordinary people just went, oh, here we go again, flipped on the generator, went about their day. Really no problem at all. The rich people, they never get their power turned off normally. The power will get turned off to the hospitals before it gets turned off to where the rich people live. The rich people didn't have backup generators and things. They didn't reckon they needed them. So they were incredibly unresilient because of that. But the ordinary people, because they had to be resilient, they were already prepared. And it didn't really affect them all that badly. So it was fascinating doing the research for that particular paper, looking at how if you have a system that's too good, that everyone takes completely for granted, then they're not going to be resilient because they reckon they don't have to be. And then when that system, if it becomes just this huge structural dependency, and then suddenly isn't working properly anymore, that's when you have a real problem. That's when your technology trap closes. And closed technology traps can be very, very dangerous.
I want to turn a little bit in our conversation. I know we started talking about the stock markets and whatnot, but I think probably most of the viewers are on board with the markets are extremely volatile right now. And unless you're a trader right now, I mean, even for the traders, I think a lot of them don't know how to make money on it. So I mean, unless you're an expert and you went to university and you've got your PhD, it might be best to stay away with it. Is
yes.
that? Okay.
I would say sit on the sidelines in cash unless you want to watch it pretty much 24 hours a day, and you want to be absolutely manically obsessive. And even then, the odds of losing your shirt will be higher than the odds of coming out and doing well. So for most people, sit on the sidelines in cash, protect what you have. Don't have what you have invested in the system if you can manage not to, because you can control risks like fire and flood and theft. You can't control risks like what's happening on the other side of the world that might collapse a bank that's going to then collapse your bank, for instance.
Well, and the same thing with like food and things. Like you can take care of having your pantry stocked, and you can take care of having your garden growing, but you can't take care of whether or not they're going to plow the onions or the potatoes or dump the milk or euthanize the pigs or whatever is happening, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I was going to turn to the difference between New Zealand and the United States as far as the bailout money. So the bailout money in the United States, there was some really weird figure I saw the other day. It said, well, you know, bailout money was $3 trillion or something, but then you add the Fed and it was more like 6 trillion or something. And then if you divide that by the 300 million people who live in the United States, that's like, oh, I don't know, $10,000 a piece, or I should be able to do this math, $20,000 a piece or something. And I don't know, it was I hope my math is right. But of course, most people here have received maybe 1,200 per person, and that you had to, you had to be in the tax system and you had to have your, all these things. So I don't know what fraction of people in the US got that money, maybe 1 out of 3, 1 out of 2, something like that. But how did things go in New Zealand? Because my understanding was that a lot more of the bailout money ended up in people's pockets.
Well, I haven't really looked into that to any great extent. I haven't had to, because so my partner can work from home perfectly well. So our income stream hasn't been affected. And I haven't had to look into that because it didn't apply to us. That is definitely something that I would like to look into. They definitely were more generous than the States. Everywhere was more generous than the States when it came to bailouts. So the idea is to pay companies enough money to keep people on so that they don't have to just let people go. And the States didn't really do that. So I think the States increased unemployment insurance, and then was supposed to give everybody $1,200 if they met a list of circumstances. But that's really going to be just trivial. It's not going to make even a dent in the size of the need that's going to rack up after another couple of months. So
what do you think of the idea of like a universal basic income? Like,
I think it's going to be absolutely necessary for a while. I mean, I have a feeling that it's one of those things that works well in good times and is probably not going to work as well as people think in bad times, unfortunately. I think it's a nice idea, but a whole lot of things that are nice ideas just don't get much traction when people are in an angry, frightened kind of mood. So I don't know.
Apparently that's what Bernie Sanders has been suggesting. He was running for president in the US, and then he decided not to continue, but he's still a senator, a US senator.
Yep.
And there's this big bill that the US House of Representatives apparently passed, but now it has to also be passed by the Senate. And apparently it's not going anywhere. And the president has said, no, there's been enough. And Sanders' position, and not just him, but many, is just get money to the people. Like, send people money, like every 2 weeks, send them some money.
Absolutely. And I think in circumstances like this, if they don't do that, there will be a revolution. So I think the consequences of not giving people the means to keep their families fed are going to be absolutely massive. And I don't think the administration is aware of that. I think they're just completely out of touch. They haven't the faintest idea how ordinary people live their lives. And they seem to think that people can just go for months without having any money, and then everything will just pick up the way it was before. And that's absurd. That's definitely not going to happen. I think some kind of UBI is going to be necessary. The reason I don't think it'll work over time is that if everybody is getting a certain amount of money per month, prices will simply go up to meet what the market can bear, because that's what prices sit at, what the market will bear. And if the market can now pay higher prices because everybody has more money, then the prices will go up and people won't be any better off. So when people do the pilot studies on UBI, they're doing it in one area, and they're saying, okay, in this town, we will do a UBI experiment. And they find that it makes an enormous difference and people are much better off and people are happier. But the prices didn't go up because the prices are set more nationally. So if you just give a little bit of extra money to people in one area, that's not enough extra demand to force prices up. So you actually do make people better off. But if you are giving it to everybody, then prices are going to end up going up and people won't be better off. What you'll probably get is a benefit in the short term, and then over time, that benefit will be removed. That would be my guess. So I think we really need to be thinking about local currencies and things like that. Because if you have a UBI, you still have a system that's basically at a national level, and that's when you're going to get problems. If you have systems that are local currency based, where the money can't leave because it's only a currency in an area where it operates, then I think you can have things running differently. And I think that would be the better boost for trying to run systems in a depression, would be going for something like that in the longer term.
I'm going to breathe just for a moment and remind anybody who is watching, I mean you, please hit the thumbs up, and please put in a comment. And if you have not subscribed, please subscribe and hit the bell so you get notifications. Next week, I believe Nicole said on Tuesday, United States Tuesday, no, Monday, United States, Monday, United States at 6 p.m. Eastern time is when we're going to be calling with her again. And if you are watching this, later, then there should be another video you can watch after this one. So I'd like to turn to just a really, really general question.
Mm-hmm.
Misconceptions. People have misconceptions about how things work in the world. Politics, economics, government, all sorts of things. People used to have a misconception about, and I guess people probably are born with the misconception that the sun actually goes around the earth, and it comes up and it sets, and the moon comes up and it sets, and they're going around. And that's a very easy misconception. It looks like it 99.99% of the time, until you get like an eclipse or you get a telescope to look at Jupiter, and then you're like, wait a second, this has just got really, really weird. Is there like a number one misconception that you think people have, something that they, in general, that the average person just is unaware of? Or
well, where money comes from would be right up there. So I think if people
where do people think money comes from, and then where does it actually come from?
Well, I mean, it comes from thin air. It's just printed into existence, and not even.
Where do they think it comes from? Where do people think money comes from?
Well, they think it's generated with business and savings, and they think banks are lending out of the savings that people have put in. They don't realize typically that banks are controlling the money supply, and that there really isn't an overall control, and that this is a huge problem. Even when you have a system with central banks aren't actually controlling the entirety of the money supply, even although people think that they are. So anytime anybody extends credit, they've expanded the money supply. So for instance, Sears doesn't have to ask the Fed if they can give you a Sears card. But when they've given you a Sears card, they've just expanded the money supply, for instance. So that when you have a credit expansion, you have credit is expanding the money supply right, left, and center, and it's not under the control of the central banks at all. So you just have this massive amount of credit creation. And I think that's probably the biggest misconception, that people think that there's a system that's under control, when actually it isn't under control at all. And it's hurtling towards a brick wall at 90 miles an hour, because you have all this system that creates credit all the time. And if you don't continue to create credit, then that is going to implode. So people don't realize that there's this cyclical boom and bust arrangement as well. People think you can get rid of that somehow. You can't. I mean, there is a boom and bust cycle. There always will be. It's an emergent property of civilization. And in fact, there are larger and smaller booms and busts. And we need to.
Nicole, I need to stop you there for just a second. We are living in 2020. There must be a way that we could get rid of all the geniuses, the MIT grads or whatever, that could get rid of this boom and bust cycle.
It's an emergent property of civilization, unfortunately. Once you reach civilizational scale, boom and bust is just baked in the cake. I mean, we go through these cycles absolutely all the time. People will see an opportunity and people will jump into that opportunity. More people will jump into it than the opportunity can support. So then you get everybody building something in that area at once. They all become economically marginal at the same time, and they all go out of business at the same time. And it's because you just have people not sort of spreading out effort. You have people looking for opportunities and all diving into any opportunity that opens up. And it's not just humans. I mean, if a tree falls in the forest, a whole lot of weed plants will jump into that open space because now there's some light. There's more water than there was before. There are soil resources that are there. So yeah, everything jumps into the open space in the forest and will take advantage of those conditions while they're there. But eventually new trees will come up, and those initial plants that invaded that open space will now go away somewhere else because they can't be there anymore. So there are some plants or some creatures that are just constantly taking advantage of opportunities that open up, and so they're constantly moving around from opportunity to opportunity. Others tend to be much more specialized and they stay where they are. So you get something that's very, very sophisticated, but only works in the one place. And if something wrecks the context it operates in, then it doesn't work at all anymore. And I think we are going to see a whole lot of opportunities open up, but we're also going to see a whole lot of problems with that, because that doesn't mean that opportunities open up nicely. They may well open up in very unpleasant ways. And then the kind of people who are taking advantage of that opportunity might be doing it in a really rather unpleasant way as well. So I do think opportunities are going to be there. And most of the opportunists, I think, are going to be pretty ruthless. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be, it wouldn't be something I'd be wanting to do, I think, jumping into that kind of opportunism. But I know a lot of people will.
It sounds like you're suggesting, as far as money's concerned, that I could actually like make money by just going to the bank and saying, hey, I own this house and I want some money, and I'll sign your paper that says, you know, I'll give you interest. And then they just type it in the computer, you know, $50,000, and then I go buy my boat or whatever. Yep. And that money didn't come from anywhere. I just basically made it. It was just like the agreement I made with the bank. And yep, that can't be right.
Absolutely. And now there are more claims on your house than there were before, because now.
But that money had to come from somewhere.
And it came from thin air, just because that's what the banks are legally allowed to do.
So if everybody like just went in and did this, they'd be like just making money, basically. Yes. But yes, it would be
for hundreds of years.
But it would be debt-based money, right? Because you have to pay the interest. So it's not the same as if the government creates it, because yes, if the government creates it, you don't have to pay interest to the government. Well, I guess taxes. But if you create it yourself with the bank, then that's kind of like what people call debt-based money, right?
Yep. And yeah, debt-based money has problems. Every time we go for debt-based money, eventually it ends in a huge crisis. And that's exactly what's happening this time.
Now, if you're online right now and you have questions, or if you had an earlier question that I didn't answer the way you were hoping, go ahead and rephrase that. I'm happy to take some questions. That's perfectly fine. Any other misconceptions other than where money comes from? Like, because you're saying basically that money is just trust or faith or claims on the future, right?
Yep. I mean, there are huge misconceptions with energy as well. People take energy for granted. They take all the convenience that we've had all this time completely for granted. So when you try and explain to people just what an incredibly rare circumstance it is to come across the amount of energy that we came across as a species in the form of fossil fuels, when you try and explain to them the implications of that, what we managed to achieve as a result of it, and what the implications are for when we've used it all up, people have such a hard time wrapping their heads around that. They just don't see it. It's invisible. So why wouldn't it always be there? They particularly don't understand energy return on energy invested very well. So people tend to think that energy is equivalent, and it's really not, because you have to understand how much energy you're getting out of a system. So compared to how much you had to put in to do it. And there are a whole lot of energy production systems where you're really not producing energy at all. All you're doing is producing an enormous amount of money for some companies' shareholders. So there are companies that are basically just flipping land leases in a giant Ponzi scheme, real estate Ponzi scheme. That was true of the fracking for natural gas some years ago. The head of Chesapeake even came out and said so explicitly, said they were losing money on every unit of gas they produced, but they were making money flipping land leases. That was their entire business model at the time. So yes, there are tons of misconceptions with energy, and that is really, really important. People in general often don't seem to have much of a sense of limits. And I think it depends on where you come from as to whether you have a sense of limits. If you live in a place that seems almost infinite, like a huge prairie, where no matter how far you walk, things still seem pretty much the same, you're less likely to think in terms of limits. Whereas if you live sandwiched between the mountains and the sea, and there's not a whole lot of growing space, you're more likely to grow up thinking in terms of limits because limits are obvious to you. If you live on an island and, well, the land ends here and there's an edge, then you're more likely to start thinking in terms of limits. And even if you have a big place, I mean, Australia, for instance, is huge. So you would think they might not have a sense of limits, but because their environment has a tendency to kick them in the head at a moment's notice with, hailstorms and floods and wildfires and droughts. And I mean, Australia doesn't do weather by halves. It really goes for the full intensity of the experience. And so when you know that something can come along and do that to you and completely upend your life at a moment's notice, you grow up with a sense of being aware of what can happen. And I think the people who are going to solve these problems to the extent that they can be solved are going to end up being people who grew up with an inherent sense of limits and who know that you have to live within limits and who know how to make that work. Whereas there are a whole lot of people who just don't have any sense of limits at all, who don't think limits even exist, to think, well, we're clever, and so whatever limits there are, we can always circumvent them. And people like that are just dreaming in Technicolor. They really are. And it's a shame because often they tend to be people who have a lot of money and a lot of power and influence in the world. And it's in their own interests, they think anyway, to keep going the way they are because the system has treated them so well. So why would they want to start thinking about things that might make the system treat them less well? They don't want to know about limits. And that's a real shame. But it just means that they're not going to be part of the solution. They're going to be part of the problem. And we really need to find the people who are going to be part of the solution and try and work with them as much as possible and try and connect them with each other. That way they can work on best practice for different circumstances.
So one thing I often think about, well, not often, but I must have heard this at some point. I don't think this is an original thought as far as energy is concerned. If you and your buddies hop in the car and you go to the gas station and you only have enough money for a gallon of gas and you're on empty and you drive to the city, but the car runs out of gas. And then, you got to get home. So you and your buddies push the car home. Mm-hmm. I mean, that kind of demonstrates how much energy was in that single amount of gasoline that you put in the car. That, yeah. I mean, not only is it all that energy and sweat, I mean, you're burning calories, pushing this car for a couple hours, 3 hours to get home, 4 hours to get home. And if you have to go up a hill or whatever, you and your buddies pushing the car, switching around. I mean, that's a lot of energy. And you're going like 2 miles an hour and that, or, 3K per hour. And you were driving like 70 or 110K or whatever. And I mean, that's a huge difference, isn't it? I mean, people don't, if you had to pay people to push you to town in the car, I mean, it would be an enormous amount, right?
It absolutely would. And that's one of the things that happens first, that becomes unaffordable first, is the labor of other people. So if you look at the way things operated in the past, people did almost everything themselves. So there's a place called Upper Canada Village on the St. Lawrence River, for instance. And they have it set up as an 1860s village. And they would say, okay, well, here's the bakery. But they weren't baking for you. They were baking for the military camp down the road. You were baking your own bread at home. And there's the dressmakers, but she wasn't making dresses for you. She was making dresses for the lady in the big house. You were making your own at home. And it went on that sort of theme that basically the ordinary people were doing pretty much everything for themselves. And there would be a handful of things that they couldn't do for themselves that they would actually use what tiny little bit of money they ever got their hands on to be able to purchase. But most people didn't live in a monetary economy at that point. They lived on a very small scale, barter and gift exchange and things like that. And you know, people at the moment assume that there's always going to be a way to pay someone else to get things done. And that won't necessarily be the case. When people have fixed costs, they can only work for a certain amount of money. They don't want to work for lower than their fixed costs will allow them to. So there's a limit to how much you can cut their wages before they just won't do the job at all, and neither will anybody else. And then you just end up with jobs not getting done and things piling up. For instance, in England, we had the winter of discontent. We had the 3-day week and garbage piling up all over the place. And that's the sort of thing that is likely to happen. General strikes and things like that.
So my car can go about 40 miles on a gallon of gas, 40 or 50 miles, a US gallon. And so if I had to hire people to push me, that's 40 miles. It's probably 2 miles per hour. So that's 20 hours. Let's see, 20 hours times, let's say $15 an hour, times say 4 people. So that's like $1,200 worth of labor that you can buy for $2. And the $2 is only because there's tax on it. I mean, it's really, I mean, the raw gasoline that comes to the service station is probably only $1 a gallon at most. So it's like discounted by 1,200 times, something like that. Is that, that's like really, that's real, right?
Yeah. People have no idea what it is that they get from fossil fuels that they would not have without them. It's everything. Like just about every single thing in the life of a person in a developed country, they would not have if it weren't for fossil fuels. But they think it can continue this way. And they seem to think, oh, well, eventually we'll just all be rich. We'll all be living middle-class lives. And no, we won't. The only reason that we have middle-class lives on this planet at all is a combination of fossil fuels and the fact that we have a system that sends money upwards from the base to the top of the pyramid. And we're quite well up not at the very top of the pyramid, obviously, but we're quite well up it. So that has floated all boats at our level, but it's at the expense of other people who have even less than they otherwise would have done. So it's not a world that works for everybody.
So you would say there's misconceptions about money, where it comes from. There's misconceptions about energy. There's misconceptions about limits. Are there misconceptions about government and politics and organizations in general?
Oh yes, absolutely. And the best series to watch to really find out how government works is Yes Minister, and then the follow-on series Yes Prime Minister. They're from England in the 1980s, and it's basically a minister, his chief civil servant, and his private secretary, and it's all about the sausage making process of government and all the sort of political pressures and how decisions are made. And it's brilliant. It's really, really funny. I mean, and it's extremely educational as well. But yes, I mean, people have all sorts of misconceptions about government. And I think one of the biggest problems is they assume government is government no matter what scale it is. And I would say that's absolutely not true. I mean, if you have a small scale government, then you can have something that's really quite responsive to the people who are being governed, and they can learn from its mistakes and things like that. If you have a very large scale government, all of that is gone. I mean, no ability to learn from mistakes, no ability to change the direction, and a huge amount of momentum in the direction that it's going in, so that it really can't be reformed. It will eventually hit a wall and collapse, and something else will take its place. But yeah, so there are quite a lot of governments that are just absolutely pathological at this point and completely unreformable. So they're not going to be any source of solution for anything. Other governments in places where they're smaller countries may well have a role as being part of the solution. And I think certainly local governments can be part of the solution. But I think there are a whole lot of large scale governments that are only ever going to be part of the problem. And that's going to be a huge issue because a lot of people look to governments for solutions. And often governments achieve the exact opposite of what their stated goal is. And they don't necessarily achieve anything useful at all. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But people tend to think of government as all good or all bad, and it's really neither. I mean, it provides good public goods and things, but it also ends up becoming really sclerotic and unreformable over time. And then you end up with something that's the same format that it had originally when it used to work properly, but it doesn't work the way it used to anymore. So it superficially looks the same, but it doesn't necessarily function the way that it did before. It becomes hostage to vested interests and things like that. So systems tend to last for about 250 years, and then they collapse and they are reformed in some other structure.
I want to remind again, anybody watching, this is Aaron Wissner from Local Future. I'm with Nicole Foss from New Zealand. And if you are watching, you can put it on 2x speed or 1.5 speed if you're not watching it live. And also like and subscribe and comment and hit the bell so you get notifications. Let's turn just a little bit for like today. So today is May the 17th or 18th for you, 2020. Anything in the last few days, last couple of weeks that you think is really newsworthy that you've been paying attention to, perhaps?
Well, there's a big debate at the moment of whether the virus is man-made or not. And I don't pretend to know the answer to that question, but it does seem to be becoming a very loud and interesting debate. So I don't have an informed opinion to offer, but there are quite a few people who do have informed opinions on both sides. This is what makes it so interesting, that there are people who are equally well informed on both sides of that debate. So it isn't clear where the answer lies. But I do think that if it turns out that it was man-made, then it's definitely going to drive a whole lot more unrest than would otherwise have been the case, because then I think people will start the whole blame game all over the place, and that will be absolutely horrible. I don't think it will help in any way. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter where it came from in a sense. It matters that it's here, and it matters what we're going to do about it. But I think the way people respond to this will change significantly if it does turn out that it was something that somebody cooked up in a lab. And it just seems to have so many different ways that it attacks the body. It's been fascinating looking at all these different things that can happen from one small virus that arguably isn't even alive. This tiny, tiny little piece of RNA can get into a body and change so many systems and just completely screw up the way things are supposed to work. So this has been absolutely fascinating to me, looking at all the biological mechanisms for this disease. And I definitely expect to spend quite a lot more time on that, because it's going to have so many knock-on effects in all the other systems I've been writing about for all these years. And it's accelerating the process of moving into a depression and things, and accelerating hitting limits to growth. Irresistible to me.
Any other news items that you found particularly interesting, trends you're seeing?
There are huge trends towards opening things up. And I think part of the problem is that people it's going to be like a spring bouncing back. So I think the idea was to open up gradually, but I don't think people are going to do that. I think they're sort of going to rush out and just want to get back to doing everything that they were doing before. And that, I think, is a problem, because if they do that, then they're going to have another lockdown in their future, and they're not going to like that. It makes a lot more sense to do the lockdown properly at the beginning, get it over with, and then you don't have to do it again later on. Whereas if you mess around and don't do it properly, then you just end up having to do it umpteen different times, and people get angrier and angrier each time they lose some of their freedoms. I mean, you don't want to lose your freedoms, but if you can just do it properly at the beginning, then you can get back to some kind of normality. Whereas, yeah, making a pig's ear of it, which is what's happened in the States, is just guaranteeing that people are going to be angry and have a lot less freedoms for a long time. And that I think is a real shame. But people are really pushing back on that now.
It seems like smaller places, like especially island nations, and like places where they've really been able to, I mean, really absolutely close the borders, they have been doing the best. Like I've heard New Zealand has done well, Hawaii, various other places are doing really well, like not just flattening the curve, but smashing the curve.
Absolutely.
And so it seems like it's partially also a factor of geography.
Oh, yes.
And of not just geography, but the organization of the government. Like in the United States, the federal government, you know, is kind of taking a little bit of a back seat to the state governments. And then the state governments are all doing different stuff. I mean, they're like, they're not actually all doing different stuff. There's like five different levels.
Into blocks.
Yeah, they're kind of working in blocks. And there was even a map that kind of showed this recently. Although Hawaii is like, you come to Hawaii on the plane, number one, you're isolated. Number two, we're going to put an ankle bracelet on you. And if you leave your hotel room, we're going to ship you back to the mainland or something like that. So,
yeah, I mean, New Zealand also had a huge advantage in that it came here late. So it had already hit lots of other places. So it helps when you're the last one who gets hit, then you've had time to learn from other people's experiences. So it's not just that New Zealand got it right, although I would argue they absolutely did. They had huge advantages as well that other countries simply didn't have. So if it comes to you late, you can learn from other people's experiences, and you're an island so that you can just shut off the travel, then there are things you can do that are just not ever going to be an option if you're, say, Switzerland or something like that. You know, if you're right in the middle of a continent, you know, it's much, much harder to close off all your borders. You can try, but people will find ways to get in and things. It will be more difficult. And the people who got hit first didn't have anything to learn from. Places like Italy, I think, got hit really, really early, and they had no idea what they were facing at the time. So they were just sort of doing their best, but at the time they didn't really have that much of a sense of how to deal with this. And over time, they've managed to improve things a lot. So at first they thought it was just a respiratory disease, and the thing to do was to put people on ventilators really early. Turned out that wasn't the best thing, because their lungs were still capable of breathing. It's just that their blood wasn't carrying oxygen anymore. So the ventilators were actually wrecking people's lungs. And that's probably why the case fatality rate was higher in Italy, because they just didn't know.
Oh my gosh, that's really scary. Is that like a true thing, that the ventilators were actually less effective than not on the ventilators?
Well, sometimes you need to use a ventilator, but
Sure.
the assumption was that people's lungs were tired. And so you put someone on a ventilator to breathe for them. So you paralyze their lungs, then the machine will breathe for them. But the machine breathes at high pressure. It's forcing air at high pressure into the lungs. When the lungs are already inflamed and things, that can be the last thing you want. If your lungs are all inflamed, you can actually make the inflammation so much worse that, I mean, I think from the statistics I'd seen, like 80 or 90% of the people who went on ventilators died. It was a really, really high death rate. And they found that it's more of a blood issue, and you need to deal with the inflammation more than shoving high pressure oxygen down people's lungs. But often just a cannula, a nose cannula. So they do need oxygen, but they don't necessarily need to be on a ventilator. So they're finding so many more things.
This implies that just delaying catching this, I mean, assuming this is something that most people in the world are going to eventually come in contact with, it would be much better to come in contact with it in the future after the medical community has figured out this stuff, right?
Yes, I mean, unless in the future there's some kind of mutation that makes it a worse disease or something, which is who knows. But yes, I mean, if the medical communities had a chance to really learn how this disease works, and they learn what are the things you can do up front to prevent getting it in the first place. If you do get it, what are the treatments you want to give, and what stage do you want to give them? So it looks like if you take vitamin D, vitamin C, selenium, and zinc, you're less likely to get it in the first place and things. And even if you do get it, you're more likely to have a mild case of it. And if you give antivirals, you need to give them early. So there are things like that, hydroxychloroquine and things, it might work, but the way it's been tested is in people who are really, really sick. And that's not the way to do it, because that's not the time when you'd want to give antivirals. You want to find out when you can give antivirals in order for them to have the best impact. And that would be early on in the condition. And we may come up with other ways of dealing with people who are even sicker that we don't currently know about at the moment. But I think
this reminds me of a news article I read, which was explaining that people who are waiting to go to the hospital until they are like having trouble breathing, it's way too late, because their body has actually been having trouble breathing for several days. Yes. And their body's actually just breathing deeper and deeper and deeper each hour until they're like up to 100%. Like they're taking these big breaths and they don't even realize it. And then when they go to the hospital, it's like, well, you if you would have come in 5 days ago, we would have been able to treat you so much more effectively. But here you are, you're at 100%, and your blood ox is way down, and you put the little finger thing on. It's like
finger thingy, and they're not expensive, but that way you can tell if you're hypoxic, because part of the problem is that people don't necessarily realize they're hypoxic, because it's not falling levels of oxygen that are the trigger to breathe. It's rising levels of carbon dioxide. So if your lungs are working well enough to expel carbon dioxide, your body doesn't have a way to tell you that it's not getting enough oxygen. But if you put this little thing on your finger and your blood oxygen level is way down, go to the hospital right away, because then there are things that they can do before you got super, super sick. Once you've got really sick, it can be very difficult to do much of anything. And a lot of people who end up in the ICU don't come out of it again, not walking under their own steam anyway. So you really want to get the disease dealt with as soon as you possibly can. And that, I think, is going to be how we get this under control. We end up with, how do you get people healthier so that they don't get the disease in the first place, or that they end up having just a very mild case of it? And then if we can find treatments that we can give early, make sure we identify the people who would benefit from those treatments and make sure they get them early, so that we don't end up with people desperately sick. Because if you can open up a country if you have ways to prevent people from getting the disease and treatments if they do get it. And unlike a lot of people, I'm not waiting for a vaccine or anything. Personally, I don't think a vaccine is going to ever happen. They don't have vaccines for coronaviruses typically. mRNA viruses mutate more quickly. They're not something you can typically make a vaccine for anyway. So I don't think there'll ever be one, but I do think there will be treatments. So I think treatments are really where we need to put our efforts, because we're going to need to open up the country, or all the countries. Otherwise, there simply won't be an economy and you'll end up with mass starvation. So you have to open up the country, but you don't want to do it in a way that a huge number of people die unnecessarily, because then you won't have an economy either. Economies are made of people. And so you have to work out how to make people more robust, and then how to help them to have a milder condition so that they can get back to work and things. And these are the things that I think are really going to have to be a huge, huge focus going forward.
Again, if you're watching online, especially on YouTube, if you want to put a comment in the comments, if you're watching real time, that is, so we can ask some of those questions. Nicole, it's been almost 2 hours. I don't want to go too much longer because, you know, I've got kids here and you've got kids there. But I'm willing to go a little bit longer, especially, are you willing to play a little game?
What kind of game?
It's like a question answer game. I ask the questions, you answer. but your part of it is to try to answer in one word.
Oh, well, I can try.
Okay, so here we go. So I'm very curious about people other than you to learn stuff from. And so I'm going to give you names, and I'd like you to respond with one word. If you don't know them, you could just say pass. But if you know them, you could say something like smart, clever, a liar, crazy, yes, him. Oh, that's 2 words. Do you want to play?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Stephen Hawking.
Oh, insanely intelligent. He's fascinating.
Daniel Quinn.
Yes, I do know who he is. His work is insightful, very, very insightful.
Vandana Shiva.
Yep, she's an incredible force of nature.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I find he has a lot of integrity. It takes a lot to stand up to your own tribe and to go along with what you believe in, even when everybody tells you you're nuts. And I actually agree with a lot of what he's doing.
Jared Diamond.
I know of his work. I haven't actually read it, so it's probably not terribly fair to comment. But from what I know of, from what other people have said, his work is very interesting.
Tolstoy.
Don't know enough to comment.
Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, an inspirational figure for sure.
Jane Goodall.
Another incredibly inspirational person. I mean, someone who's devoted her entire life to another species. And yeah, she's a fascinating person too.
Nassim Taleb.
I haven't read his books, but I have them, so they're definitely on my pile. And I think he's put out some really interesting ideas, particularly the concept of anti-fragility and things. So I would definitely recommend his work, although I will recommend it more strongly when I've actually got into it more myself.
Naomi Klein.
Oh, The Shock Doctrine. Yes, absolutely. Very important book. I think everybody should read The Shock Doctrine.
Noam Chomsky.
I found his work absolutely fascinating too. One thing that I would say, though, that he absolutely does not understand peak oil. I did a radio show with him and Jim Kunstler, Dmitry Orlov, and somebody else whose name has escaped me. And he was saying, oh, well, of course, peak oil has now been put off by more than 100 years. And Jim Kunstler hung up on him.
Oh, no. I want to hear that radio show. If you have the link, send it to me.
It was on NPR a few years ago. I don't know if I'd be able to find it, but who knows, maybe. But yeah.
Elon Musk.
Snake oil salesman.
Really?
Oh, yes. He's very good at getting money from governments to come up with overblown ideas. So it's not that nothing he's done has ever worked. Obviously, some things do. But when he starts talking about hyperloops and stuff like that, it's just, oh, for God's sake. There are some really fascinating videos that, do you know of Thunderfoot? He's a science guy.
Thunderfoot, is that a person? No.
Yes, his name is Phil Mason. He's a scientist. And he does a whole lot of videos on science. And one of the things he does is debunk things. And so he's done some really good debunking videos on Elon Musk's Hyperloop and on SpaceX and stuff like that. And his stuff is funny too. He really picks apart these ideas apart because the devil's in the detail. Elon Musk is very good at getting money out of people. I think he's nuts, and I think he's a snake oil salesman.
That's really interesting. Michael Hudson.
I think he's had a lot of really good ideas. I have a whole lot of books of his as well. Definitely someone to watch.
Darwin.
Well, yeah, fascinating. I was a biologist originally. Evolution has always absolutely fascinated me. And I did biology, and I did a minor in geology and things as well. So in geology, it was paleontology and the history of life and things that I was particularly interested in. So yes, Darwin was a huge part of my original background.
Okay, I'm about halfway through the list. Again, if anybody's live online, throw some names in the chat box because we'll get Nicole's reaction. Nuriel Rubini.
Well, they call him Dr. Death, but he's Dr. Death Light, I think. He's sort of just acceptably bearish enough. I don't think he's anywhere near bearish enough, but people will listen to him. He has a position, and he has a certain amount of gravitas, so people will take him seriously. But I think he doesn't always get the true seriousness of the situation.
Richard Wolff.
Not a name I know.
Edward Snowden.
Well, I've heard a lot of things about him, and whether or not he is actually a foreign spy, I do not know. I probably would say I don't know enough to truly have an informed opinion about whether he was a good guy or not. And I don't really know what his motivations were for doing what he did, but it was useful to know the extent to which people were being spied on.
Raul Ilgari.
You mean Ilargi?
Yeah.
Well, we've been friends for years and years, but I mean, he ended up becoming a Trump supporter, and I think he'd been reading totally the wrong sources. They're a group of writers, Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, Aaron Mate, Michael Tracy, who are all writing about the same kind of things, and they are all spectacularly wrong in just about every way. So Matt Taibbi was great writing about pensions. He sucks writing it about Trump and Russia and things like that. These people tend to be so keen to take down the establishment that they seem to have the attitude that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that's not true. So they're siding with the Trump administration over neoliberalism. And whatever you think of neoliberalism, the Trump administration is worse. So they're taking the wrong side of things. I mean, not that neoliberalism is great either. It absolutely isn't, and it's going to collapse. But at the same time, they've been poo-pooing the investigative work people have been doing, looking at what's happening with the Trump administration, and trying to undermine all the work that's been going on about the administration being compromised by foreign powers. And there's so much information out there, and they've been trying to undermine that case. And I think that's profoundly wrong. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. But there's a lot of the media out there at the moment that is trying to do that. It's a shame.
Max Tegmark.
Not a name I know.
Eliezer Yudkowsky.
I don't recognize the name.
Yuval Noah Harari.
Nope, I don't recognize that one.
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Oh yes, well, he's an astronomer. His work is interesting. I like people who popularize science, particularly astronomy and astrophysics. That was something I was very interested in when I was young.
Zero Hedge, whose name is Daniel Ivandijiski, I think.
There's a lot of interesting stuff on Zero Hedge, and it's written by a whole bunch of different people, so it varies a lot in quality. But I've found that there's a lot of really useful information there. Often it's really technical, so it's not for just an everyday audience. But I don't know the specific author you were writing about, but Zero Hedge in general, I think, is a site well worth reading.
Well, I think Daniel's the one who runs the site and invented the site. And I think that to a certain extent, he's the curator. When people submit things, that he looks at it and he's like, oh yeah. And then some things that aren't authored, he's the author of, or I don't know exactly how it's organized, but Amy Goodman.
Democracy Now! I think Democracy Now! is very useful. You need to ask those kinds of questions. Don't defend democracy, then you lose it.
One from the internet, Nicholas Georgescu Rogan.
I recognize the name, but I don't know enough about what he does to comment.
Okay. Chris Hedges.
I like him. He wrote a book called American Fascists some years ago. So he was writing about Christian dominionism and the potential for fascist theocracy in the States. So he's written a lot of really good stuff. I like his work.
George Carlin.
I love George Carlin. He's absolutely hilarious. He's my favorite American comedian by far. Yeah, he was such a thoughtful person. It's so funny.
Okay, the next two you can pass on if you want to. The Buddha.
I don't really know a great deal about Buddhism other than you're supposed to respect all life and that you're not supposed to get attached to things to the point where they own you. And so I don't know a great deal more about it than that. I mean, it sounds quite a nice way of being in the world. I think it's more of a way of life than a religion per se. So I definitely think it sounds better than some of the other alternatives.
Well, again, and you can always pass. So Jesus of Nazareth.
Well, I mean, I'm not a religious person, so I pay very little attention to these things because I tend to think that they're methods of social control more so than anything else, and I prefer not to be controlled. So I'll leave religion to other people.
Aristotle.
I find philosophy a lot more interesting than religion, shall we say. But I find things like that very interesting. I haven't formally studied philosophy. It would have been something I could have done at university, but it isn't something I ever managed to fit into my schedule. So I wouldn't know a great deal about the details of different things that people have written.
David Hume.
Don't know.
Karl Marx.
Again, another economic philosopher, and I think he actually had a lot right about his description of the problem. But I disagree with the fact that he was suggesting if we have these revolutions that we'll end up with a workers' utopia. So I would say, well, no, you're definitely not going to end up with that. But his critique of the problem and the fact that money was basically going upwards, not downwards, I think that was very accurate.
Adam Smith.
Another one who's interesting ideas at the beginning of economics. So he and David Ricardo both having ideas that sort of set us on the current path towards neoliberalism. But it's not that they were wrong about everything. They were right about a lot of things. The circumstances changed, though. I mean, when you suddenly open up all the borders and money and people can move around all over the place, then some of the things they were writing about no longer work in the same way that they were writing. And I think that ended up being a problem. So comparative advantage that Ricardo was writing about, for instance, really only works when you can't just have everything move to another place.
Okay, and again, some of these you might or might not know, and if you don't know them, just pass. Graham Sheehan.
Nope.
Bertrand Russell.
I know the name, but not enough to comment.
Eugene Debs.
Nope.
Rosa Luxemburg.
And I know the name, but not enough to really comment.
Karl Liebknecht.
Nope.
Randolph Bourne.
Nope.
Ralph Nader.
Well, I think he managed to spoil an election some years ago. I heard him give a talk once at one of the ASPO conferences, and I really wasn't impressed. I mean, there seemed to be a whole lot of things he didn't understand about energy, and I didn't know why he was even at the conference.
Oh, let's see. Boy, Ray Dalio.
Nope. I know of the name, but moment.
Chamath Palihapitiya.
Nope.
I think I've exhausted most of my list. I'll come up with a new list for next time. Which names did I miss? Like, who do you trust, Nicole, when you're like reading stuff or when someone's writing or they have a video and you're like, oh yes, I want to listen to her. I want to listen to him. Oh, he's so clever. He's so truthful. She's so insightful. I mean, there must be many people.
Like Sarah Kendzior and Seth Abramson at the moment.
Sarah Kendzior. Tell me about Sarah Kendzior.
She lives in St. Louis, Missouri, and she did her PhD on authoritarian regimes in the former Soviet Union. So her thing is authoritarianism. And she's looking at how the States is following the same playbook. She's absolutely brilliant. Seth Abramson is a lawyer and a professor of journalism. And so he's been looking at everything that's been going on in terms of the rise of organized crime around the world and things in recent years. So his work is absolutely fascinating too.
I'm sorry, I missed that just for a second. Seth
Abramson.
Abramson.
So
Is that the one? Is that the one who wrote the book about the Russian collusion?
Yes, yes. He's a professor at the University of New Hampshire.
So Sarah Kendzior, Seth Abramson, like who else? Because they don't write like on a daily basis. So are there other people that you're like, do they?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else that you listen to? Because I'm always looking for more people to learn from.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it really depends what sort of field, because I have people in different fields that I would go to.
Well, is there anybody that you look to as like a polymath that you're like, oh, well, I guess I need to reconsider that because he just said, or she just said something that contradicts what I would have
John
thought.
Michael Greer is really, really interesting. And Richard Heinberg, of course. And there are just so many. I'm particularly interested at the moment in people who study the rise of authoritarianism. So Timothy Snyder and Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Martin van Creveld is a military historian as well. I find his work really, really interesting. There are so many.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we did pretty well today. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Okay.
I think I just use a nature break and things as well. So it's probably good timing to finish now.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all your time today, Nicole. And over the last several weeks, if you are watching this now, I've chatted with Nicole, I think 4 or 5 times now. So you can look back. If you go to Local Future on YouTube, you'll be able to find the previous videos and watch those. And we plan to talk again next week, one day later. So instead of 6 p.m. Eastern time on a Sunday, it'll be 6 p.m. Eastern time on a Monday, U.S. time. And then, of course, in New Zealand, that would be Tuesday. What is it there, 10 a.m. when we started your time? Yeah. Okay. So, and thank you for everybody being on tonight. I really appreciate it. If you could press the thumbs up button and put in a comment and say thank you to Nicole and subscribe and then share the video with somebody, copy the link and send it in an email or Facebook or something. That would be really great. We want to just make sure everybody has good information because this time we're going through is a kind of challenging time right now. And a lot of people, there's a lot of different possibilities for the future, but I think we've kind of narrowed in on a few of them. Any last words from you, Nicole?
Well, I'll see you again next week, I suppose. There's always more to talk about.
All right. Thank you so much. And everybody, have a good one. Bye-bye.